Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to say a few words today. So, freedom despite restrictions. I like to think of that as new rules, but also new liberties. We are living in extraordinary times. We've had to change our work methods in order to thrive and survive. As Marla said, I've worked with the government on resilience, and I was involved for 10 years on the national planning, risk planning, and particularly pandemic planning. And even in the worst case scenarios, we never considered a global lockdown. And we are seeing how that comes through, and it's a whole new experience, but a whole new opportunity for many organisations who'd heard of Zoom before February this year. So as Marla said, I've worked in the energy and utility sector for 37 years, providing critical and national infrastructure and essential services. In my sector in the UK at the moment, we face three major business disruptions, which is shaping our businesses into the future. The first one, which again Marla mentioned, is the government target of hitting net zero emissions by 2050. And for us, as a fossil-based business, this is a real game changer for us, and that game changer brings great opportunities for it, but also great uncertainty. The setting of our price control as regulated businesses, we have a price control, and the way to think about that is setting the contractual terms for the business over the next 5 years, and doing that in the context of an energy transition. So again, lots of uncertainty and ambiguity. And then responded to COVID, taking actions to ensure that the power's on and that we can see each other on the technology, and that the technology works, and that we're keeping people safe and warm. Consumers' tolerance to disruptions to service have really diminished over the years. I worked in the Northeast United States, and a lot of storms come through there. And if you go back 5-8 years, every winter you would take out 1 million, 2 million customers, and people would be pretty happy if they got their power on in 4 or 5 days. Superstorm Sandy, which many of you will remember, that hit the eastern seaboard, hit New York and New Jersey, really changed that dynamic to 20 minutes. And that 20 minutes was based on people's ability to have their phone batteries working. So if you take the average phone and the level of charge it will have at any point in time, 20 minutes is your limit before you start to get frustrated. Superstorm Sandy was a few years ago. I dare say that 20 minutes is even a smaller number now than it was then. Utilities are very simple businesses. We manage assets and we manage people, and we manage data. And it's quite an odd concept. When people think of energy utilities, they don't think of them as data companies. But we are data companies. Eastern Electricity here in the UK was the first non-governmental organisation to buy a mainframe, demonstrating that need to manage and crunch very large volumes of data. And even today, that how do we use and manage data is vitally important. So in this time of change, strong leadership is required, both operational and strategic, day-to-day, and setting those future goals. So dealing with the crisis today, but knowing where the organisation is going. These times demand a more agile style of leadership with a greater ability to adapt. A style of leadership that's prepared to be self-critical and empathetic to employees and their families. and we've seen that. The lines between professional and personal have become very blurred as I sit here in my dining room talking to you. And who hasn't got an incredulous story of the last 3 months of seeing a colleague's half-naked partner walk in the background and make a cup of tea? But in these times, leaders are required to provide clarity and assurance to the people that they lead. And in my experience, organizations are at their best in crises. The mission is very clear. The roles and responsibilities are very clear. Data is prioritized and delivered efficiently, and therefore people are engaged and motivated to deliver against that mission. I've often been asked the question, so what are the barriers to translating this into daily operations? And quite frankly, it quite often boils down to organizational politics and ambitions, but also that human nature to build in complexities. So I want to reflect on 3 perspectives. Leadership is not hierarchical. In my time, I have worked for some truly inspirational leaders, and I've seen many inspirational leaders. But probably the most impressive example of leadership I've ever seen in my entire career was a lowly assistant engineer who was responding to the Grenfell Tower fire in West London. And he demonstrated all of the attributes of leadership. And I think in organizations, we often underestimate the power of leadership going through the organization and get too distracted by the power of leadership at the top of the organization. My next point is humility. Humility is a strength if used wisely. Humility is an important trait, I think, of good leadership. And I reflected, my most abiding memory of the COVID crisis is the Dominic Cummings, who is an advisor to governments, giving a press conference in the Garden of Number 10. And I believe a bit of humility would have got him out of the hole, rather than trying to argue technical compliance with the rules that actually he had written as a member of government. I think humility would have gone a long way. But by showing no humility, he broke that critical thing, which is trust. You need to be able to trust your leaders. Not showing humility is a weakness, but also showing too much is also a weakness. There is a very delicate balance, and that is about integrity, I think. Thirdly, the third point I'd like to raise is focus on people's strengths rather than their weaknesses. Our management development frameworks focus on eliminating weaknesses, and our performance management systems tend to penalize weaknesses and often take strengths for granted. And we quite often forget what people are good at and get very focused on what they're not so good at. And that is the strength of focusing on teams, as was mentioned in one of the earlier talks. So we need to develop new ways of working for employees and customers. And we need a more flexible and dynamic organization. There's been a tendency, I think, in lockdown for business to become more transactional and be lacking in depth. And I think we need to find new ways of being creative and delivering those innovations. So I'm moving on to the question point here then. So I believe that the winning way is to make it easy for the customer. In electricity, we have a concept called the path of least resistance, and electrons follow the path of least resistance to Earth. human beings inherently like to follow the path of least resistance. So how do we simplify the enterprise and use data to provide insight and intelligence rather than store and block up decision making? And so I just finished with saying I like to think of Vyntelligence as a neural network, because it is, how do we get those important pieces of information and how do we get them so that they can provide insight and intelligence? So thank you very much.